This week we're going to look at responsive web design, which you may have touched on already, but you may not have as well, and that's okay. But essentially, responsive web design came about as a design philosophy in response to suddenly having more than one device that people access web pages from. So if we think back to basically pre-2007, before the smartphone as we know it today became kind of ubiquitous, pretty much all websites were consumed from either a desktop or a laptop computer. And so as a designer, you could be pretty sure that if you designed your layout to a specific pixel dimension that was within the range of computer displays that people had, then it would look correct on pretty much everyone's computer that it was going to appear on. But then came along smartphones, which were obviously a much smaller display, and pretty quickly a lot of web traffic started to occur over smartphones, to the point where certain websites, particularly things like social networking and stuff like that, are the primary method of consumption of those websites are actually phones rather than desktops these days. So at that point, when it was sort of desktop and phones, the approach was usually to create two different websites. You'd have a website that was your desktop website, and you'd have a separate website that was usually your iPhone website, because iPhone was, for a little while, was kind of the only player in the game. But that pretty quickly became evident that was a short-sighted approach, because obviously heaps of other phones sprung up of all different sizes, and even the iPhone hasn't stayed consistent in its size or its pixel density or things like that. And then as we move along further to sort of now, then we're just sort of starting to get another sort of evolution in devices as well. So we've got things like smartwatches and wearable technology, and virtual reality headsets. In car displays, we've got internet connected TV. So we've got a whole myriad of devices that will obviously only become more popular in the future, which again fragments the landscape in which we need to design our interfaces for. So once you get to a certain point, it pretty quickly becomes infeasible and unmaintainable to have separate websites to target each of these different devices and all variations of them in between. So this is where the idea of responsive web design came in, and it's pretty much been around for the good part of a decade. So it's not something that's really that new anymore, but they're still adding features or ways to deal with it, and it's still becoming sort of standardized in across all web browsers. But generally, the idea behind responsive web design is that rather than having separate sites with different devices, that we have the one site and we simply have a style sheet which is adaptable to those different devices. So we only have to maintain one code base, and our style sheet, while a little bit more complicated, we only have to maintain one style sheet. So if we decide to make a change across the website, we don't have to go and make it on all these different websites. Okay, so we do that with well, actually, before I go on to that, this link here that I've got is a link which I think is a good general overview of the whole responsive web design thing, hosted on Google Developers, and it goes through a lot of the stuff in nice detail. I'll let you read through that in your own time, but it's definitely worth a look. but then this next bit here is outlines some of the approaches to the responsive design methodology. So generally we approach responsive design from one of two directions, because you've got to start somewhere. Okay, so either we start with the desktop or the largest interface, and then we work our way down and we pare things down until we get down to the smallest interface. Okay, at this point usually mobile. Or we go the other way. We start and we design the mobile interface first, and then as the devices get larger, we add things, or we adjust the layout so that it better makes use of the wider screen space available to it. And there's a few, what this outlines is a few different methodologies on how you can sort of approach that. If you tend to look at your website as certain different areas of content, these describe how, sorry, it's the wrong link. If I click this link here, these describe some ways of approaching that. So the author of this article has broken up into a few different methodologies, and they've got sort of images here that outline how this works. So the first one here they've got is the mostly fluid approach, and basically these are all approaches from going from a multi-column layout down to a single column layout, which is pretty much the only layout that really works on a phone display, the single column layout. So this is the mostly fluid approach, where you generally just have your columns defined in terms of non-fixed width units. So rather than defining the width of your content areas in pixels, you define them in percentages, for example. And then they will size based on the width of the browser window or the viewport or the device itself. And then ultimately, when you get down small enough, you'll reach a point where those columns are too narrow, and then you change the layout so that it stacks. Okay, and then there's other ones here where rather than having fluid layouts, you simply just drop columns and stack them underneath the other ones as the display gets too narrow. A few other ones here, which again I'll let you read through, but another interesting one that kind of stands apart from those other ones is this off-canvas technique. And that takes an interesting approach where rather than taking horizontal columns and then stacking them vertically as the display becomes more narrow, what it does is it basically hides a bunch of the content off screen and then has a way of triggering it to appear on the screen. So the best example of this is kind of the slide-in menu that Facebook sort of pioneered with their mobile site menu. So the menu here by default is not visible. So they've determined that the primary content is the news feed. The menu is not something that people always 100% need to use, so let's not show it by default. Let's not have it showing up here and taking up precious screen real estate that most people not wanting to use it will have to scroll past. So instead, they've hidden it basically off the left-hand side of the browser window, and then they just have this button here which triggers it to slide in and then again to slide out. Okay, and so the author of this article calls this the off-canvas approach. So this has some more examples of various different versions of that. I'll let you read through that again in your own time. So when it comes to the technicalities of how we tell our website to behave responsibly, is pretty much all done with a combination of two things, and both CSS things. Firstly, we try to, wherever possible, avoid fixed units. So if we can have fluid containers, that takes care of a lot of the responsiveness for us. Okay, so if we have, instead of saying make our content 1,000 pixels wide, make it 80% of the browser window, and then as that scales down, the content will adjust for it. Okay, but there is a certain point where, particularly if you have multi-column layouts, that columns can get too small in order to be legible. So at that point, we do actually have to redefine the CSS so that it lays out in a different way. And for that, we use media queries. So media queries are actually an extension of something that's existed way back since CSS2, but they've extended it in CSS3. So media queries originally were designed for you to specify different style sheets based on whether the web page was being viewed on the screen or being printed out, for example. So commonly you would have a print style sheet and a screen style sheet, and they might look different. So on the print one, you might get rid of any menus and stuff like that, stuff that you obviously can't click once it's printed out on the paper. So in CSS3, they've extended the media element to actually be able to query much more things about the device that the web page is being viewed on. Okay, and I've got a link here which which details all the different things that you can query in terms of the media query. Okay, and this here is actually a list of all of them. Okay, so there's things like the most common things are the device dimensions, width and height. But you can also do things like query the pixel density of a device, so you can swap out different resources. If it's like a Retina display, you can have larger images or more pixel dense images. Okay, you can do things like query the orientation of a mobile device. Look for different things to do with the color capabilities of the device, for example. A whole heap of different things. Having said that, the great majority of all the work that we do in CSS with creating a responsive layout is pretty much just adjusting the layout based on the width of the device or the width of the viewport. Okay, and we would do it with a bit of CSS that looks something like this. So the syntax of a media query looks like this. We use @media, and then in the parentheses here, the round brackets, we have a condition that needs to be met for the CSS that's contained in these curly braces to be applied. Okay, so in this case, what this is saying, this media query max width 600 pixels, basically what's that saying is if the viewport width is 600 pixels or less, then apply this CSS, otherwise ignore it. Okay, so I've got a very simple example of this, which I'll start off by showing you that, and then I've got an exercise that I want you to do, which is a little bit more complex, but is basically just an extension of this same principle. So I've got a link here to an example on CodePen. So the idea here is, let me just get rid of that and get rid of that. Okay, I'm just going to pair this right back to simply just a heading 1, okay, and then a style for that heading 1 element. Okay, so the idea with this is what I want to do is I want this to adjust responsively so that this heading becomes smaller as the device becomes smaller. Okay, because while that heading might be a suitable size on a desktop display, okay, on a phone display that's ludicrous. It's going to take up the entire viewport. So what I want to do is I actually want to stop it from ever even wrapping onto 2 lines. So what I'm going to do is I want to set what we call breakpoints to say that when the width is less than a certain amount, to then change the font size of that heading. So I do that with a media query. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out sort of the width that I need to set my breakpoint for. And the way I can do that, in CodePen here, it actually tells me down here the pixel width of here, so I could use that. But on any other given web page, okay, I would, again, just open up a website. Okay, I would again suggest that you use the code inspection tools. Okay, so let me ditch that. So in Chrome, if you do this, it will tell you up here the width, but you can also just select the the HTML element of the document, and it will tell you that the width there. So it's showing me down here the width there, and as I modify the width of that, it updates there. So that's the way that you can find out where your breakpoints need to sit. Now the other way to find out where your breakpoints need to sit, and you might see this if you look up anything to do with media queries, especially if it's an older article, they might suggest this method, and I will mention it because you'll see it, but I don't think it's the better way of doing it. So you won't see me doing it. But originally what people used to do is they used to go, well, I'll target these devices and then I'll go and figure out what the dimensions are of these devices, what the widths are, and then I'll set up my media queries with breakpoints for each of those. Okay, so there is links here which will give you various different media query breakpoints for all different devices in portrait and landscape mode, and you can do it that way. But my suggestion is that you don't, for a couple of reasons. One, you might end up writing an unnecessary number of media queries, okay? Because you might have a layout that actually works on both an iPad and an iPhone, and so splitting those two up into different media queries might be overkill. And the other thing is, again, this approach is kind of tying you to targeting specific devices. And as we well know, devices don't stay the same for very long. So if you do this, you're kind of locking yourself in again. So my suggestion is that what you actually do is you start from one end to the other. You start from desktop and size down, and just figure out where the layout starts to break, and then choose that as your first breakpoint. And then add a media query to overwrite the CSS so the layout looks good there, and then keep going down and keep going until you get to the smallest one. And what you'll find is that even though we haven't specifically targeted devices with this method, if you then go and test it on any devices that you want to target, you'll find that it actually looks good on all of them anyway. So it really has all of the benefits and none of the drawbacks, this method. Okay, so here we are. We've got our heading 1 that's got a particular size, font size of 4 EMs, and when the width gets down to about 850 pixels, okay, what I want to do is create a media query which says, okay, when this width is 850 pixels or less, let's make this font size small enough so that it fits on one single line. So down here I'm going to write my media query. So I do that with @media. Okay, and I will say max width, colon, and then the value I want. So 850 pixels. And then all I need to do is redefine the font size style for my heading 1 element. So I'll write that in here, H1, font size. Okay, and it was 4 EMs, so I'll see what it looks like at 3 EMs. Okay, and there we go, that fits, that looks like it fits nicely. So now I can test this, I can adjust the width back and forward. I can see now that works nicely. So rather than wrapping around on multiple lines, okay, it stays nicely on one line and just shrinks down the text size. Now obviously this isn't, at some point this is going to wrap around again there. So all I need to do there is set another breakpoint again and make the font smaller again. So if I look down here, I can see I need to do it at about 640 pixels. Okay, so let's go there. Okay, and what I'll do is I'll simply create another media query. So @media, max width 640 pixels. and redefine the font size on my heading 1 to be, say, 2 EMs. Okay, so now we have three levels of responsiveness on our design. Okay, and obviously I could keep doing the same process, adding more media queries down to as small a device as I want. Okay, but I'll stop. I'll leave it at this many because I don't want to overcomplicate this example.
So why would you use the media queries rather than just setting a percentage with the maximum size?
For the font.
Yeah.
So the issue with that is if you set the font size as a percentage, it actually doesn't. That percentage is not based on the width of the container. The percentage then refers to the font size. So you can't really responsibly adjust the text that way unless you use JavaScript.
Okay.
Yeah. So. But if it was something else like simply a container of text that I just wanted the text to wrap, then absolutely you could just have like a div with a paragraph in it and set that div to be 100% of the width rather than 1,000 pixels, and then it would get smaller and smaller. So my advice would be where you can make things responsive by just using relative units of measurements, do that first, and then when that's not enough, also add in media queries to adjust the layout in other ways. Okay, so that's reasonably straightforward to understand what's going on there, I hope. But there is a couple of things that tend to trip people up with how media queries work, and it's based on some assumptions that people tend to make that it makes sense why they make these assumptions, but it's not necessarily the case. So, for example, having written this, you would be, I mean, it would be logical for you to assume that what is going on is at this width, it's just looking at this CSS. At this width, it's just looking at this CSS. And at this width, it's just looking at this CSS. Okay, but that's not actually what's going on. And a better way to think about this is rather than looking for the element in the CSS and seeing what applies, think of it more like this is a heading 1 in the document, and it's going to go through the CSS, and any CSS that's relevant to it, whether it's in a media query or not, is going to apply. So this heading 1, okay, at the full width here is yes going to apply this, and it's not going to apply this, and it's not going to apply this, okay, because it doesn't satisfy these two media queries. When it goes to this first breakpoint, okay, this media query is now satisfied, so it's going to apply this, but it doesn't mean it ignores this, okay? It still keeps this. Any styles that I have defined here generally are still going to be applied, all right? And it's only the ones that I override that are going to get changed. Okay, so if I change the font color here to green, okay, it's still going to apply. And that happens even if we have multiple media queries, okay? So now at this one here, the third breakpoint, this media query is being applied here, okay? But as well, this media query is being applied here, and a lot of people forget that because at this screen width, which is about 450 pixels, okay, yes, that's less than 640 pixels, but it's also less than 850 pixels. This doesn't all of a sudden not become true, right? So it actually uses a combination of both of these. So if I have a color defined here as, let's make this blue, okay, even though it's not defined in this breakpoint here, you can see it's still applied at the smallest breakpoint, okay, because both these media queries are relevant. Now you can if I wanted to make it so that only one of these media queries were relevant, I could combine this and say, make this media query only apply between 641 pixels and 850 pixels. Okay, because I can add extra conditions here. I can say max width 850 pixels and min width 641 pixels. Okay, now if I do that, in this case, when I get to this second breakpoint down here, okay, now you'll notice that that's not applying. It's not applying that blue color, okay, because I've told this, well, because all we have to do is look at the logical condition test that it does, okay, so at 450 pixels, okay, yes, this one's obviously true. That's true, but that's not true. Okay, 450 pixels is not going to fit into a query that has min width 641 pixels. So basically, if any of these are false, okay, it's not going to do that thing there. Okay, having said that, I would recommend that you don't do that anyway. But you just have to be aware of some of the things that you might run into if you do this. So again, I just want to stress that media queries don't necessarily do anything that special other than this condition here. They don't add any extra specificity to the selectors here. So this is no more specific than this one here. The only reason that this one's overriding this one here is because it appears further down in the code. Okay, so as we kind of went over last week, the only time that being further down in the code is relevant is when they have the same specificity. And these all do because they're all just a heading 1. But what that means is if I take, okay, let's say I want to make the font color red at this smallest breakpoint. Okay, so it'll go from green to blue to red, which works. Okay, but if I take this, the smallest breakpoint, and I put it in the code above that middle breakpoint, you'll notice that it doesn't go red anymore. Okay, and that's because, and again, a lot of people make this assumption, which it's logical why they would, but it's not how the media query works. A lot of people assume that it will apply with the most importance the media query that is closest to the actual width value. And yes, the width value is closest to this one, but it doesn't care. All it cares about is whether or not this condition is true. And because again, both these conditions are true, and because this is defined further down in the code than this, all right, it's the blue color and the 3EM's font size that get applied rather than this. So actually, this is never doing anything. Okay, this is always getting overridden by this because there's never a case where this is true and this is not also true. Okay, so there's some of the things you can run into. The way to avoid that is to work down in steps. Okay, so start, depending on whether you go big to small or small to big, start at one end and then move down in steps. Okay, so your media queries should, if you're going big to small, your max widths should always get smaller as you go down in the code. And if you flip it the other way around, if I wanted to do this from small to big, okay, then I'll show you that process as well. What I would do is I'd start small and I'd set the font size to be how I wanted it to look on the mobile device, and then I would set my media queries as I got bigger. Okay, but again, I'm going up in steps. I'm not doing that one and then doing the in-between ones. I'm going to do the small one, and then I'm going to go up to the bigger one, which for me here, it's not so much that the layout is breaking, but it's that with that much space, that heading is starting to look a bit small. I could use more of the space available to me. So what I'll do here is I'll create the media query. Okay, and if you're going from small to big, or what I'll call mobile first, then rather than max width, you want to use min width. Because you basically want to say, set my default styles for this width, and then anything that's, and then you get to a breakpoint and go, anything that's this width or bigger, apply these styles. So rather than max width, we'll use min width. And I'll set that to 640 pixels, and my heading 1, I will set the font size to be 3ems. Okay, and now you can see it's the same process but working from the other way up. And then when I get even bigger again, okay, so let's say at 850 pixels, set the heading 1 font size to be 4ems. Okay, so I've achieved the same effect, but I've approached it first from big to small, and then secondly from small to big. Now the other thing I should mention is that you don't have to use pixel units here for your breakpoints as well. You could use relative units, so you could use percentages, for example. Okay, and although having said that, you will mostly see people do pixel widths just because it's a lot easier to figure out where the breakpoints go, and also devices tend to be measured in pixels. So there's nothing wrong with using pixel units for your media queries. Okay, now, so that's obviously a very simple example. But basically, you can put as much CSS inside a media query as you want. Okay, so that's the whole point. When you get a more complex interface, like the example that I'm going to give you, you'll identify several things that need to be changed. So you'll restyle several different things within a media query. Now, in terms of the approach, mobile first or desktop first, there's not necessarily one being better than the other, but they do have sort of their advantages and disadvantages. And I'll demonstrate that by showing you the examples that I'll get you to work on. So for the exercise, I've got two links here. I've got, it's essentially the same site. Again, like last week, it's a partially completed site. And one of them I started from mobile first, and the other one I started from desktop first. So if you were to download these, what you will see is something that looks like, I'll just open them up. Okay, so again, a fairly standard page layout. Okay, but this one I've done, I've designed the desktop interface first, and this one I've designed the mobile interface first. Okay, so what your job is in each one of these for the exercise is to take this and complete the CSS with media queries, figuring out where you need to add breakpoints and then modifying the layout for that. Now, just to talk about the pros and cons of each of these methods, I guess the benefit of doing a desktop first approach is conceptually it tends to be a bit easier, because pretty much everyone starts out when they're first learning web design stuff, their first sites are done for a desktop browser. You don't usually start out creating websites for the mobile. So most people are sort of already used to thinking about designing in terms of a desktop interface. So that's the benefit. The drawback is that the default layout doesn't scale well without adding, obviously, media query breakpoints. Okay, so below a certain amount, even though I've got these columns are fluid, so they size down a bit, at a certain point, these 4 columns here are going to become too narrow to be comfortably, like to have a comfortable text measure. And eventually so small that it's pretty much illegible and things start overlapping. Whereas the mobile first approach, while it may be conceptually a little more difficult to think about if you're not used to designing mobile sites from the beginning, the benefit that it does have is even without adding any breakpoints, as I make this site bigger, while the layout's not necessarily the best use of the screen real estate, it still is usable and at any size. Okay, so I could still, this is still a functional site where I can still read all of the content and access all of the interface elements. So that's not to say that I recommend one over the other, and for the exercise I don't mind which one you start with first. Probably the desktop first one is a little easier to get your head around if you're used to having desktop, if you're used to creating interfaces for the desktop. But I would like you to attempt both of them, so do one and then do the other. So just remember, if you're going desktop first, okay, you want to size down till you figure out the layout's going to break, create a breakpoint using media query with max width, and then step down and change the layout until you get to the mobile. And if you choose the mobile first approach, then you start there and then you add breakpoints where you think the interface can be laid out better with the media query, but you use min width, and then you step up and step up and step up. So if I just show you the completed examples of these for a moment. Okay, so these are the completed example, and by the time they're complete, you actually shouldn't really notice any difference between them, even though one was done mobile first to desktop and the other was done desktop to mobile. Okay, but this is, I mean, you don't have to take exactly the same approach to adjusting the interfaces I have, but just to show you what I did is, at my first breakpoint, I got rid of the sidebar and rearranged things so that the menu went from a vertical menu in the sidebar to a horizontal menu up the top. I changed these from 4 columns to 2 columns, and then that supplementary heading, which was below the menu previously, gets put down the bottom next to the footer. And I only have 2 breakpoints in this layout, and then there's the next breakpoint there. So going from desktop down to mobile, I figured the next place the layout breaks was when the width gets too narrow to accommodate that horizontal menu. So at that point I decided to change that back to a vertical menu, and then also go from 2 columns of these featured articles down here down to 1 column. So that's the approach I took. I don't really mind if you take a slightly different approach, but I did only need 2 different media queries for that. Now, if you look at, I guess a couple of other things to note is if we look at the style sheet, Okay, so what you should see in the style sheet when you download it is I've already put in the default styles, and depending on which one you download, it's the mobile one or the desktop one. But a couple of things to note that might make it easier for you to figure out what's going on. Firstly, I've used the box sizing border box, which, as we discussed last week, makes us able to size columns and stuff without having to worry about how much extra size padding and borders adds to them. Now, I did actually have to add this Moz box sizing prefix version of that as well, because actually the version of Firefox that are on these computers is about 10 versions behind the current one, and it doesn't support the just standard CSS3 definition of box sizing. But that's okay. I've modified the example so the files you download they should work with that now. I've given you a clear fix style that you can use. The other thing to notice is that all images I've made to have a max width of 100% and a height of auto. Okay, and that's so if that's so that the images scale fluidly with their containers. Okay, if you don't set a max width 100% on your images, then they will start to overflow the containers. And then I guess the other thing you want to know is if you're starting with the desktop layout first is in terms of these columns. So this whole section here, all right, is inside a div called made content, and you can see that I've got that set to float right and have a width of 75%. This navigation over here, and also this supplementary heading, you can see I've got set to float left with a width of 25%. Okay, so that's what's defining those two columns. So the first thing you want to do if you're going to want to remove that sidebar, okay, is to, in your media query, override the floats on those elements, set them to none, and then set their width to 100%, and that will make them stack as single columns. It'll be the same deal with these feature articles here. Okay, so at this point, and again, your code inspection tools are your best friend for this. Okay, the articles here, when they're stacked 4 across, they're simply flow to left the width of 25%, and to make them stack 2 across, okay, I changed the width. I changed it here to 48%, which is almost 50, but that was to leave a 1% margin either side. Okay, so hopefully that starts you off in the right direction. Now, I did say I would show you the responsive design tools in Firefox as well. So if we open up these, okay, so in Firefox you want to look under Tools, Web Developer, and Responsive Design View. Okay, and you get a similar thing here, which allows you to modify the size of the viewport. So that allows you to test the responsive view. It also gives you predefined sizes here that you can use, and you can again use your inspect element to see what CSS is actually being applied. Okay, so if I just take this main content div here, okay, I can see that there is the default style, float right, width 75, and as I size down and hit my first breakpoint, okay, actually I have to, sorry, this is the mobile first one, I have to open up the desktop one in order to show you that. So, let's go back again. Okay, full size, the main content. Okay, and there you can see, there it is defined, float right, width 75%, and it's on line 74 of my style sheet. As I size down, okay, you can see that I can look over here, and you'll notice that there's the main content style, the default one, okay, but they're crossed out because they're being overridden by the main content style, which is in the media query, which I wrote on, well, in my complete example is on line 170. Okay, so again, get used to using the development tools to allow you to figure out if you've got multiple styles, which one's actually being applied. It'll help you debug if your media queries are not being applied how you think. This will at least let you know which one's being applied instead. Now the equivalent in Chrome, so far I've just been scaling it like this. But Chrome browser, if you prefer to use that, actually has this really good device emulation mode. So if you bring up the developer tools and you click on this little icon here, you can actually emulate all sorts of different devices, and you can select from them down here. Okay, so well, you can also drag these little sliders here. Okay, but you can select devices here as well. So I could select, for an example, an iPad, let's say, and then I can click to rotate it from landscape to portrait mode. Sorry, I just have to refresh so it displays the content properly. Okay, so from landscape to portrait mode. And this is a good example of what I was talking about before. I didn't take the approach of targeting specific devices. I started at one end, figure out where the layout broke, and then adjusted it. But I can tell now, just by viewing these in the different device emulations, that the layouts, to me, still fits really nicely. So in the landscape orientation, the iPad is actually still giving me the biggest view, and that's fine because there's enough room for that. Whereas if I had specifically targeted this, I may have decided to give it the same as the portrait view of the iPad. Okay, but once I flick this around to the portrait view, because it's narrower, it actually goes down to that next smallest breakpoint. And I can almost guarantee you I can test any device in here, any size, and even though I haven't specifically targeted them, okay, it's going to pick the layout which, just based on the width, is going to look good on those devices. The other thing you can do with these tools here is you can actually click this little button here, and it will actually show you a list of where your breakpoints are, and you can click these and see the breakpoints. That's really good for analyzing existing responsive sites. Okay, so for example, if I load up Smashing Magazine, okay, which has a quite complex responsive layout, you can see where they're all defined there. The other thing you can do is you can actually emulate the throttling of the device, and by that we mean essentially the network speed or the internet speed. So when we think about responsive design, it's easy to think that it's specifically just about changing the design based on the size of the screen. Okay, but actually you should really be thinking broader than that. When you're thinking about responsive design, you should also be responding to any other limitations of different devices. So that includes things like the network speed that it has, but it also includes things like the input method. Okay, so in terms of network speed, we can test this here, and we can go, well, let's say we can test this site loading it on a really old GPRS 50 kilobit connection, and you can simulate loading a device, and you can see there, load this other page, you can see, if I refresh, okay, you can see it actually simulating the delay in loading the site. Okay, and you can test that through a whole bunch of different speeds. But then the other thing is in terms of, let's say, the touch input. Okay, so I had an example of this on a site that I was working on actually recently, developing a booking calendar. Okay, so on the interface it had a calendar kind of like this here, a small version of a calendar where you would click the date that you wanted to book this thing for. Okay, and on the desktop site, having something small like this was easy enough to click because a mouse cursor is very precise. And so some people make the mistake of thinking, well, all we need to do when we go from desktop down to mobile is just reorganize things and maybe make things. It's tempting just to make everything smaller to fit more stuff on the screen because the screen is smaller. But you do need to take into account that when people are on a touch device, they're not using a precise mouse cursor. They might be using a stylus, but you can't guarantee that. More likely than not, they're going to be using a big stumpy finger. So if you have things that are spaced too closely together, then it's going to be easy to hit the incorrect target, the incorrect link. Okay, so they're things you need to think about. So you may actually need to make your visual elements bigger and more spaced out on a mobile device. Okay, so they're all things you need to think about. So I'll let you go on with that exercise. Actually, there is a couple of other things I just thought of. One thing that I have forgotten to mention is when you're doing anything for a mobile device, you do actually need to include in your HTML. It's pretty much the only thing you need to do outside of the CSS. But in your HTML, you need to make sure you use this meta tag for the viewport. Okay, and generally what we do is we put meta name equals viewport, content width equals device width, and initial scale equals 1. And if you want to disable user zooming, you can say the maximum scale equals 1 as well. Okay, I've already put that into the example, so you don't need to do that for this example. But just be aware that in future, if you're creating them, then you need to include the viewport. There's information about that on this Google article that I've linked here. If you go down and look at under the guides, the first one, set the viewport, it explains everything to do with that. Okay, and that will make sure things scale correctly to a mobile phone display. Now the other thing is, this sort of goes back to the question earlier about scaling font sizes, and there's a question about couldn't we just do it with a percentage. There is actually a way you can do it with JavaScript, and I have included in this example an example that, but I decided to take it out because it requires JavaScript. I didn't want to get into JavaScript yet. I didn't want to do too many things this week. But if in the example the example that I've given you, I think these 3 lines are these 3 lines are commented out. These 3 script tags. If you uncomment those, what this is doing is actually including 3 JavaScript files. First, it's including jQuery, which is a JavaScript library, which we'll learn about, and then a jQuery plugin called jQuery Fit Text. Okay, and basically what that's designed to do, if I open up the site, basically what it's designed to do is to scale text based on the size of its container. Okay, and because there's no way currently anyway to do that just with CSS, it uses JavaScript. So what it does is it detects whenever the viewport is resized, and then it adjusts the font size in pixels based on a calculation based on the width of the container. So there is a JavaScript solution where you can do things like that, and I have sort of included it in this example if you uncomment those 3 lines of code, then it will actually work like that. So if I open this one here, which has it, okay, what you'll notice is that for the title here, I've got it applying to this title and this title here. And rather than jumping down in discrete steps with different breakpoints, you'll see that it adjusts sort of fluidly with the width of its container, which is a little bit nicer. Now I could have just gone in and put heaps more media queries in there, but this requires this does the same thing without requiring me to add heaps of extra media queries. So you don't need to worry about that too much. I did comment it out of the example because I didn't want to overcomplicate things. My suggestion is that you just, for now, handle your responsive text sizing by changing it in the media queries. Okay, are there any questions about any of that stuff that I've just gone over? No? Okay, well, I'll let you go on with that exercise. As I said, pick either the mobile first or the desktop first one, and if you finish one, go on the other. I'll post the completed example next week, and you can compare your solution to mine. Okay. So I'll hang around again, obviously, to help if anyone had trouble with last week and wants to ask questions about last week's exercise. I can do that. Or if you're trying to do this week's exercise and having trouble with that, we can do that as well.